Now that you've created a class that derives from DbContext, let's go ahead and use it. Now that we've configured the container to support Entity Framework and our context, let's go ahead and open our app controller and actually use it. Now earlier we saw how we could inject the mail service into the app controller. We can add more services here that we need, like our DbContext. I'll bring that namespace in, and I'll just call it the context. And then I'll store it here so that we can use it in our class. And let's take our index here and let's try to go get a collection of the trips. Context class, as you remember, now has stops and trips as properties. Has some other data access methods as well, but we'll get to some of those later. Let's start with just trips. And I'll say toList to get a collection of the trips. Now this isn't working because we don't have link namespace. So let's add system.link. And so this is going to just do a dumb execution against the context to get all the trips. We can make this a little bit more query-like by adding something like a order by clause. And let's just order it by name for now. So what we're seeing here in this simple call is that we're going to get the trips, and then eventually we'll pass these trips down into the view so the view can display those trips on our main page. But we'll get to that in a minute. Let's see what happens when we attempt to access the database using this context. It said no database providers are configured. Configure a database provider by overriding on configuring or add DbContext method when setting up the services. What's really happening here is we're not telling it where to get the database information or who owns it. All we've done is made available in the startup here the configuration information. Now, there's two ways to do this. We can actually, inside the configure here, decide and configure SQL Server, but the other approach that I prefer is to actually do it in the context itself. This way the DbContext is self-describing. We do this by, like it said in the error, overriding on configuring. And on configuring hands you an options builder, this object that has the different options associated with it. And we can actually set it like options builder use SQL Server. So we're telling this context, hey, we want you to not only expose these entities, but let's do it using SQL Server. And if you had other database providers configured, you would see those as other options like use DB2, use Oracle, use Mongo, etc. But for us, we're going to use SQL Server. And SQL Server expects us to pass in a connection string. So how do we get that connection string? We're going to actually use configuration to get it. So let's go over to config.json, and I'm going to add a new section called data. Now, one thing you'll notice, let me do that a little slower so you can see it, is data is a common section that there's actually IntelliSense for. That's because Microsoft wants to sort of encourage this commonality of where to find things like connection strings. But this is not required. You can call this anything. You can put this in an app settings. You can put it in any structure you want, because ultimately you're going to be responsible for maintaining this. And I'll call this our world context connection. And I'll go ahead and just store it as a string. Now this will be a database connection to a SQL Server database. For us, we're going to actually use local DB to store this. But if you have a real database server out there somewhere you're going to build up that connection string. Using connection strings is a long-winded process that I won't belabor. So I'm just going to show you the database string you'll probably want to use for a local DB database, because when you install Visual Studio, the local DB SQL Server instances are installed for you. So you can kind of depend on them to exist when you're writing these first ASP.NET 5 applications. So the connection string is made up of name value pairs separated with semicolons. And so for example, server would be server with the name of period and then a semicolon to separate it. Now the four properties we're going to use just in our development context is server name, database, which is going to be the name of the database, trusted_connection, which is whether you need to supply your own credentials, and then multiple active record sets. And this is the ability to do batch querying, and often in the kind of queries we're going to be doing, we want to allow that. Almost every connection string these days to SQL Server has this marked as true. And because we're only working in development and with a local version of SQL Server, we can go ahead and just use a trusted connection, which is that connection to a database based on us as a user. And let's go ahead and give a database name that's interesting, like the world DB. So the server name is a little bit more interesting. If you're using Visual Studio Professional or greater, you most likely have under the View menu SQL Server Object Explorer. I have it docked over here on the left side so I can look at it quickly, but if you don't have that option, it may be because you're using the Community Edition of Visual Studio. So putting in the connection string we're going to build will probably work anyway, but I want you to see where this is actually coming from if you're using a version of Visual Studio that supports it. So in our case, if we look at this Object Explorer, there'll be a node for SQL Server, and if we open it, it will show local instances of SQL Server. When Visual Studio 2015 installed itself, it created a couple of instances of the local DB version of SQL Server, which is a little development version of SQL Server, though it's fully functional. What we're looking for is the local DB /projects v12. That's the one we're going to use. And so simply we're going to use that as its full name. The parentheses are important. And then double / because we need to escape the / character. Projects v12. If you're curious about the Projects v12 versus Visual Studio 2015, it's the difference between the date version of Visual Studio and the SQL Server local DB version. So now that we have this, how do we actually use this? We're going to actually build the connection string here in code by reading it from configuration. So we're going to go to Startup, Configuration, just like we got the configuration earlier for the email address. We're going to do the same thing here. We're going to use a key to describe where to get it from configuration. And this key, like we saw before, but I'll reiterate it, is going to be the name of the container with a colon and the name of the subobject. And if there are more subobjects, that pattern would continue. So this is going to be data, world context, connection. And let's set a breakpoint here and run this to see whether we're getting the connection string correctly. We come in here, we can see we're getting that database connection string from the configuration, so that all is good. Let's let it run. Now that we've run it, we can see the database couldn't be created. While we could go in and simply ensure that it's created by doing that in the constructor of the context, we also probably want to use migrations so that as the entities change, we can migrate our database from one version to another. Let's do that next.